Romans 8:28 is probably one of the most frustrating and sometimes misunderstood verses in all the Bible. It says, God works all things together for good for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. We're in Caesarea, a fantastic city from the ancient past. It's in this place that Bible verse probably frustrated as much as it ever did the very man God used to write that scripture. The man who wrote the words that we refer to as Romans 8:28 was the Apostle Paul. He was easily one of the most influential leaders in the early church's history. He started churches and congregations all across the known world, especially in countries that we refer to as Turkey and Greece. He became the most prolific letter writer in the New Testament's history, and his letters fill our New Testament. After one of those successful church planting trips, Paul returned to Jerusalem. It was there that a riot broke out on his behalf. The authorities in Jerusalem arrested Paul, promising him a safe trip to Caesarea and a speedy trial. The safe trip happened, but the speedy trial never occurred. Once in prison, Paul's frustrations must have built to a greater and greater degree. For 2 years, Paul had to spend a miserable kind of existence in a prison cell here in Caesarea, a very small place somewhere around here, only a few hundred yards away from the Mediterranean. He could hear the waves splashing up on the shore. He could hear people having a good time around this incredible city. And he had to wonder, why would God take the most successful church planter in history and let him sit, just rot, for 2 years in a prison cell here? I mean, there was no justifiable reason to keep him in prison. But here he was for 2 years. Boy, I wish I could go back and ask him in that hour, you're the guy who wrote the words, all things work together for good. Well, tell me something. What good can possibly come out of this? It would be a while before anyone could see all the good that God was working for God's glory, not Paul's glory. But several things came to light. For instance, there were Roman soldiers guarding Paul at all hours of the day and night. Paul used the opportunity to share his faith with every one of those soldiers. Eventually, in 200 years or so, there would be so many Roman soldiers who were believers in Jesus that it helped lead to the conversion of the emperor himself. And overnight, the Roman Empire became a Christian empire. Once the prison years started, and Caesarea was only the beginning of Paul's prison experience, Paul had time to write all of those letters that became all of that scripture in our New Testament. And what of Paul's friend Luke? Luke wasn't a disciple, and yet he wrote the Gospel of Luke. He wasn't a part of the early church's history, and yet he recorded that history in the book of Acts. With 2 years to kill, there's a good possibility that Luke used all of that time to turn into a reporter. He could travel to the Sea of Galilee and the region there pretty easily. He could talk to people who were touched by Jesus. He could meet some of the disciples. He could make a trip or two to Jerusalem. And surely he must have made a trip to Bethlehem. Maybe he talked to an aging shepherd. For Luke tells us some details about the Christmas story that we don't get anywhere else. God was working several things for good during Paul's imprisonment, even if Paul couldn't see it at the time. And we know that in all things, we know that in all things, God is working together for good for those who love Him and are called according to His purposes. What a great Bible verse. When Paul wrote that verse, he had enough faith to believe that it would be true. He couldn't look 2,000 years down the road and see how we would benefit from his 2 years of imprisonment. But he still had enough faith to believe that God was working good. You know, you and I have the same decision to make. We have a lot of difficult circumstances in life. We'll never be able to look completely down the road and find out how God was working together for good. But you can always make the choice to believe that God's in control. Somehow, some way, He's working for good in your life.